Welcome to Mad as Hell TV. Today we're starting our two-part series on the most censored and underreported stories in America. First up is a report about Afghanistan with Professor Zahir Wahab of Lewis and Clark College. Professor Wahab has traveled very much to Afghanistan and has visited his family and is also assisting in rebuilding the higher educational system there. Welcome, Zahir.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Thank you for having me.
Sure. I think before we get started, let's just tell people a little bit why we're saying this story is not getting reported. I know right now we're hearing a lot about Iraq, for instance, and you were just mentioning that a lot of the reporters are in Iraq, and it's just not, the story about Afghanistan is kind of getting lost. It's kind of like the forgotten war.
Indeed. Well, there are several reasons, I think. One, this is a country that is way at the other end of the planet. It's also not a very glamorous place to be in, for example, for journalists. There are no five-star hotels. There's no garbage collection. There are hardly any discos. There's no entertainment. But also there are a lot of risks involved. But more importantly, I think the Iraq war has a lot to do with it. We know, for example, that when the United States and allies attacked and invaded Iraq, we have heard that they even moved some of the special forces and their best intelligence people from Afghanistan to Iraq. But also, so the correspondents, I think many of them just followed the flag. You know, they left Afghanistan and went to Iraq. But also it looks like the American press is also very economy-oriented. They don't want to have stationary correspondence in Afghanistan because that would cost more money. So for all of these reasons, you don't hear much about Afghanistan. And the Afghans know this, and they feel betrayed and forgotten by the United States government, but also by the United States people.
Right. So we want to, let's do a little comparison to how things were in Afghanistan before the American bombing began and now after it's ended. Or has it ended? I want to just get that clear. We have stopped bombing Afghanistan. Right?
Not at all, actually.
Okay, then let's get updated on
there's
that.
fighting going on every day. Of course, prior to October 7, 2001, the country was ruled mostly by the Taliban, with the exception of the northern part, which was ruled by the Northern Alliance and Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud. And then, you know, the United States decided to bomb on October 7, 2001, even though the Taliban tried desperately until the very last moment to prevent the war and avert military confrontation. But the U.S. government would not accept that. And we can go into that later on because we know now, for example, that the decision to attack and invade Afghanistan was actually made in the summer of 2001 and not after the September 11th tragedy here. So you had a country that was ruled by the Taliban, and Taliban, of course, were put together by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia in 1994. And so by September 1996, they reached Kabul, the capital. There was very little economic activity, but you had peace and quiet. During the Taliban, there was no crime, no abductions, for example, but there was no education or much economic activity. So we had the American bombing and occupation in October 2001, and of course later that year there was a conference, a major conference in Bonn, where decisions were made to install an interim administration and a government and have some kind of a national legislation that would affirm that government that was put in place. Now, 2 years later, for example, especially since the beginning of this year, there's hardly a day where there isn't some kind of a confrontation between the United States and the insurgents or the Afghan government or the local militias. For example, since this last August, at least 400 Afghans have been killed because of this fighting between the insurgency, which are remnants of the Taliban, remnants of the Qaeda, but also a new group of Hizb Islami, Hikmatyar, and also other regular Afghans who feel betrayed abandoned and frustrated, and so they've joined forces with the opposition, and they're always attacking the military forces or the Afghan government outposts or aid agencies. And so since August, about 400 Afghans have been killed on both sides, and also 61 aid workers have been killed, most of them Afghan. So today, you know, the fighting continues, for example, but there's not much economic development going on, which we can get into later on.
Okay, so would you say in a nutshell then things really are not improved from when they were before? Because one of the big successes, supposedly, that we encountered in Afghanistan was that we got rid of the Taliban, and therefore people were liberated. This is what was reported here in the news.
Right.
So you're basically saying that's not true.
Well, not at all, actually. It's true that the Taliban were ejected from positions of power, but the Taliban have not been eliminated, and neither has been the Al-Qaeda or terrorism. And so a very recent report about a week ago or so by the Institute for International Strategic Studies, which is a very credible, prestigious London-based institution, their finding is that, in fact, there are more terrorists today in Afghanistan, but also throughout the world, than there were in October 2001. But also, if you look at the indications, for example, right now, if you go to Afghanistan, Kabul is okay because there are 5,500 international security assistance force. They keep law and order in Kabul. But once you leave Kabul, there's no law and order, there's no peace, there's no security, there's no stability, there's no normal government, for example. And so, but also there's a tremendous amount of fighting going on, especially in the lower half of the country. The situation on the ground militarily is so bad so that the United Nations and many other aid agencies have, for example, suspended operations in the lower half of the country, but also in the very north because there are factional fighting going on in the north. And that's why currently, for example, a major UN delegation is visiting Afghanistan to assess the security situation on the ground. But just 2 or 3 days ago, there was a hearing in the Senate to confirm the new ambassador to Afghanistan, Dr. Khalilzad. And Senator Joseph Biden and Senator Lugar, in fact, told, this was a statement on the Senate floor, saying that as far as they're concerned, the situation in Afghanistan seems to be unraveling. And I would concur. And so militarily, the situation is very, very bad. The opposition now, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have been actually reinforced by other Afghans and maybe even outsiders, people who just don't like the Americans in Afghanistan or the government which the Americans have installed.
So in other words, we've pretty much come full circle. The Taliban are becoming more entrenched?
In certain parts of the country, yes. And I think that's why the State Department and the Afghan government have recognized that you simply cannot eliminate the Taliban altogether, good and bad. And so for some time now, there have been negotiations going on between the FBI, the CIA, and the, quote, moderate Talibans in Pakistan. And in fact, most recently, when Under-Secretary of State Richard Armitage was in Afghanistan, Kabul, he reportedly talked to the recently released Afghan Foreign Minister, Mullah Mutawakkil. Mutawakkil, the foreign minister, gave himself up when the Americans invaded Afghanistan. He was in prison until about a month ago or so, and then recently they decided to free him because he hadn't done anything wrong. And Armitage met with the foreign minister to see if they can enfold and incorporate the moderate Taliban back into the government, which is to say it's a tacit actually recognition that the Taliban and their allies and supporters continue to be a force to reckon with.
So this war on terrorism, it doesn't seem to be really too successful from what you could ascertain. Is that right?
That's my information. And as I said, that's why the IISS in London
now,
said
what
the
is
same
the ISS?
thing. Institute for International Strategic Studies.
Okay.
Which is a very credible institution on military affairs throughout the world. But also simply by looking at, for example, people don't feel safe and secure. There are daily attacks on Afghan government forces and also on the Americans. As you know, just a week ago or so, 3 Americans were killed just in the last week or so in Afghanistan. Although it seems like the casualty figures on Americans are classified, and that's why we don't hear about how many Americans have been killed or wounded in Afghanistan. That's classified information.
So that's another part of the news that we're not getting about Afghanistan.
That's right.
Is even the casualties.
Right.
Okay, because
and
we
of
know
course
the
the Afghans don't
are
matter. But daily, if you're in Afghanistan now,
well, I'm sure you don't mean
see,
that.
no, but if you're in Afghanistan, for example, you do see every day B-52s, F-16s, Apache helicopters instead of flying all over the place, which is to say that, you know, the fighting goes on. And because there are only 11,000 or so Allied forces throughout the whole country, they rely heavily on air power to bomb whenever there are skirmishes going on.
So there's still bombing going on.
Yes.
This is another thing I think that's not getting released, and I didn't know this either, because you know we're told in Iraq, oh yes, major combat is over. Well, we found out that's not true.
It's not
now
so
we're
in
finding out
Afghanistan
that
either.
Afghanistan major combat, I assumed was over quite a while ago. So
not at all.
No, not at all. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, you know, there's every indication, and everyone would say this, for example, from the Afghan government to the UN to NGOs, non-governmental organizations, indeed to the U.S. Senate, that the situation in Afghanistan is very precarious, it's very unsafe, very unstable, and very unpredictable. And it's simply dangerous, and that's why all of these aid organizations have simply suspended their operations in at least half of the country.
Right. Well, you know, I think you were on a program with Sheila Hamilton on radio when the bombing first began, and I remember she kept asking you, well, what would you do? What would you do if you're not? In other words, there was A or B. You bomb them, or there's nothing else.
Well,
so what would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, my response would be like many thoughtful Americans and Afghans and internationals have said, for example, that one, the United States government had several opportunities to apprehend Osama bin Laden.
In fact, they offered to give him up at one point.
Well, the Sudan offered him to the Clinton administration, and they didn't want to. And then the CIA had a chance to actually apprehend him when he was in a hospital in one of the Gulf states. But just the day before, October 6th, actually, the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan was on the phone with the National Security Advisor, Dr. Khalilzad, here, saying, we will give up Osama bin Laden if you can guarantee that he will be tried in a third country.
Right, and that's the part where
many
that
efforts
was not
were
guaranteed.
made, but there was no interest in that. And as I said, because in fact we now know that the invasion of Afghanistan in October was discussed even at the G7 summit that summer of 2001.
Right.
And then there was another conference in Berlin where the Taliban delegation was told in specific terms by Karl Inderfurth, our Undersecretary of State for South Asia, that either you do this or we're going to carpet bomb you.
Right.
And so there was not much the Taliban could do, it seems, but there are other ways to apprehend or fight terrorism, but to bomb a whole country, to punish a few individuals who were not invited or produced or supported by the Afghans or the Taliban.
Right.
Because we have to remember that both bin Laden and the Taliban were American, Pakistani, and Saudi creations, and not Afghan creations.
Okay. We're going to take a break right now, and we'll come right back.
تاسو فعلا ډیر ضرورت څه شته لري اول قدم کې
د مکتب عمارت په دوام قدم کې د درسي مواد ته لکه لابراتوارونه سمعي و بصري مواد دغه مسایل ته ضرورت مبرم لري ځکه فعلا شاګردان صرف نظري درسونه لولي نه عملي.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. سه سوا وارث در
go to our next part of the discussion, which is about the political situation.
Right.
And going into that, we were talking earlier about how things are kind of backfiring right now in Afghanistan for the American government. So why don't you talk to us about what that is all about?
The Council on Foreign Relations, which is a New York-based, very prestigious nonpartisan organization, they issued a report recently labeled Afghanistan, Are We Losing the Peace? And there's another organization called the International Crisis Group based in Brussels, Belgium. They issued a report too late in August addressing the political situation in Afghanistan. And everything we know, for example, that the political situation is very, very unstable, very unsettled, very tense, and very unpredictable. We have had an interim administration that was, in a way installed and then legitimated by a Grand National Assembly in June 2002. And now currently what's happening is they're working on a new constitution for the country. Then there will be a conference of national notables, something like a Grand Assembly in December. They will finalize the constitution, and then there will be election next June, if all goes well and on schedule. In the meantime, there has not been an accurate census in Afghanistan for the last 2.5 decades, for example. So no one knows how many people live and where in Afghanistan. But also, the government in Kabul was put together to incorporate and appease different ethnic, religious, tribal groups. And so you don't have a government of technocrats, a professional technocratic bureaucracy in the central government. But you have a government that represents different factions and different groups and tendencies in the country. Mainly the problem with the government is that because it has no resources. Now remember, Afghanistan was one of the poorest countries in the world, always a monarchy, and then in recent years different kinds of regimes. But so if you go to Afghanistan now, for example, the government barely controls Kabul itself, with help, of course, from the International Security Assistance Force. But as soon as you leave Kabul, there's almost no indication of government. In some places there are schools, of course, and maybe there are government, nominally government buildings and bureaucrats and so forth. But in terms of the delivery of services, law and order, economic activity, adjudication, there's almost no government. And people keep referring to the President Karzai as the mayor of Kabul, because that's how much power he has.
Pretty limited then.
Pretty limited to the extent, for example, that his bodyguards are Americans. The president's bodyguards are Americans. That's how divided the government itself is in Kabul. And it's common knowledge, for example, that the real power is in the hands of the Northern Alliance. The Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Education, the intelligence services, and so forth, when the Karzai himself is sort of a figurehead. So that's why they refer to him as the mayor of Kabul. So politically, the situation is very, very unsettled. And right now, there's already jockeying for position, who is going to run for president, for the parliament, etc. In the meantime, according to Human Rights Watch, it's very difficult for people to campaign for political office freely. People have been harassed, they have been threatened, some have been killed, actually, political aspirants. So that's where things are. And there's no cohesion or unanimity between the government itself. There are different people representing different groups. They have their own agendas. And then throughout the country, it's the same old warlords. They're self-appointed warlords, militias, commanders, etc., who help the Americans with their pursuit of Qaeda and terrorists. But these warlords have no loyalty to the central government. The central government has no real army or police force of itself or real resources. So the different warlords throughout the country collect their own customs, for example, and give very little of it to Kabul now.
I see. So the democratization is not really going too well in Afghanistan.
It's going to be very difficult in a country, that has a history of 25 years of war, ethnically divided, regionally divided in terms of religion, but also there has been such a distrust of the government, but this government hasn't done much actually. The government doesn't have the resources or the military or the army to maintain law and order. And also a country that has never really had a real election, for example, or a constitution that was established by the people. All of this is very, very uncertain, and that's why a lot of people are talking about, you know, maybe postponing the election and the constitutional process. But it seems like the UN and the Americans want to go ahead with this and have the election next June. We will see.
So the jury's still out on that, because
Right.
it seems like, you know, I wonder if you would say that just as in Iraq, it doesn't seem like our government had a really clear plan for after the bombing. Would you say that's a similar critique for Afghanistan?
Very much so, because otherwise there would have been economic development, there would have been an effective government, for example, education, healthcare, transportation, communication, government apparatus, for example, the judiciary, the police force, the army, but none of these really are functioning. And the government itself has very little legitimacy or credibility in the eyes of most people. If there's economic activity, small-scale economic activity, it happens in spite of the government, but we can talk about that later. Again, it's almost like there's a shadow government, you know, not a real government, just a caricature of a government with very few resources and little effectiveness. A government that, for example, cannot maintain law and order, you know, cannot prevent crime, has no control over the regional warlords, the governors, the commanders, and the militias, or the narco-traffickers. You know, you can see what people would think about that kind of a government.
Exactly. So in other words, from what I understand, some people would actually welcome the Taliban back because at least they had some kind of order.
I heard people, even university people, people in the Ministry of Higher Education, taxi drivers and common people, being nostalgic in some ways for the Taliban, because they said, at least we felt secure, there was law and order, and there was no crime. The country now is riddled with crime and criminality. There's no law and order, there's chaos, abductions, murder, mayhem, narco-trafficking, for example, thievery, assassinations, you name it. Women in particular are very, very vulnerable, women and children, and we can talk about that too.
Right.
But again, people have little faith in the government because the government has not been able to deliver. And it looks like maybe that shows lack of foresight and planning, you know, what happens after the Taliban are ejected. And it's no wonder that the Americans and President Karzai have been talking to the Taliban to see if they can incorporate the Taliban into the political process and political structure.
Right. But it seems like things have just gone from bad to worse, and I just wonder, like for instance, we were talking about global exchange. Global exchange had gone over there and assessed the situation and asked for some reparations from our government, because a lot of people have lost their homes, they've lost their families, they have no ways to earn a living. And so the Global Exchange asked for like $20 million just to make some reparations for these people, and I don't believe it's ever been voted on or given to Afghanistan, to my knowledge.
No.
So
Well,
just even something as small as a $20 million reparation
right.
package, when we're already spending, you know, billions of dollars on the military, if we were just to give this little amount of money to help people, you know, get a little bit of establishment, a little bit of infrastructure.
Mark Harold, a professor at the University of New Hampshire, has kept a tally of the casualties. About 7,000 Afghan civilians have been killed. Countless have been maimed and injured. Many, many homes have been destroyed. Infrastructure has been destroyed. Roads, for example, other places, and there's very little development taking place. So the damage done to the environment, for example, the depleted uranium and its impact on the people. Several studies by Canadians and Europeans show that Afghans show a much higher rate of exposure to depleted uranium than people in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War.
More than during the Gulf War?
Yes, yes, this we know, and we can document this, for example. So there has been no reparation, paid to the people. But also, imagine Kabul, which is a city of 3 million people now. It's a very small city, terribly overcrowded, filthy and polluted. It still doesn't have regular electricity or running water or garbage service or even regular traffic lights. And
so
that
you think
shows,
if they were
for
to use some of this money to rebuild the infrastructure, that would maybe help the peace process there?
You would think so,
It seems like it. I don't, of course we're not.
Yes, you pointed out the Americans have been spending $1 billion a month on the military operation. But so far they have actually spent, and this is according to James Kunder, the chief of the USAID in Kabul, saying the Americans have spent about $700 million on relief and reconstruction. Now, there was a major conference, the donors conference, a year ago in January. They promised $4.5 billion, but very little of that money has actually arrived, and most of that money has been spent, half of it has been spent on relief and emergency services, not reconstruction.
Well, we have a lot more to discuss, and we're going to take a break right now, and we'll be right back. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining us again. We're going to be talking to Professor Zahar Wahab some more about Afghanistan. And right now we're going to talk about the economic development in Afghanistan. We were mentioning how, there's a lot of money that's been allotted for Iraq, and a portion of that was supposed to go to Afghanistan. But in fact, a very small part of that is going to...
Well, we keep hearing about $78 billion for Iraq and Afghanistan every day. 87.
Right.
But in fact, only $800 million of that money is allocated for Afghanistan, for the civilian reconstruction operation in Afghanistan, which is less than 1% of this new budget. But also, so far, as I said, the Americans probably have spent about $700 million on economic activity. The European Union, the Japanese, and some other agencies have spent similar amounts. But even just in the last 2 days, I've heard from the Afghan government officials, for example, Ashraf Ghani, the Minister of Finance, and other ministers have been saying the help that was promised to Afghanistan has not arrived. And what arrives goes directly to either the UN system or to the NGOs, because
now explain to people what an NGO is.
Non-governmental organization. There are some 200 non-governmental organizations working in Afghanistan, like World Food Program, for example, Mercy Corps, or CARE International, or other organizations. Now, when donors give money, because they say to the government, we want a government that is efficient, effective, transparent, and accountable. And because there's still no such government in Afghanistan, the donors would rather give money to the United Nations or the non-governmental organizations than the Afghan government. So over the last 2 years or so, 80% of the foreign assistance, which is not enough at all, has gone to the UN and NGOs, and 20% to the Afghan government. The Afghan government, for example, this year the current budget is $550 million for a whole country. A country that has been at war and being bombed for the last 20, 25 years, that kind of a budget and that kind of an assistance. So if you go now, for example, in Afghanistan, there really is no major economic development taking place. You see small activity, small stores, some construction work going on, etc., but that's done by the people themselves. It's the private sector. In terms of government or international organizations doing things, there's very little sign of that. The only major project that is going on now is paving a road between Kabul and Kandahar, which is financed by the Americans, Japanese, and the Saudis. But that's all. And so when these refugees return, about 2.1 million refugees have returned When they come back, because the country was also in a drought for the last 5 years, people have lost their homes, their farms, their property, etc. Many of them have gone back to Pakistan or to Iran. So the economic conditions are really, really dire and desperate.
And maybe that's why some people are getting into the opium trade again.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maria Costa, the head of the UN Drug and Crime Prevention Organization, just returned from Afghanistan. Afghanistan now produces 80% of the world's heroin. There are some 2 million Afghans actually who grow poppies. There's poppy growing in 28 of the 32 provinces throughout the country. Currently, this last year, Afghanistan produced $2.5 billion worth of heroin. The international market price would be about $30 billion. So if you're
who's
a farmer,
making the money from this?
well, the major narco traffickers. People already talk about the danger of Afghanistan becoming a narco-terrorist state and a failed state. Everyone is in on the drug business. Foreigners, local militias, commanders, even some people within the government actually. And so, but it's understandable. For the farmer, for example, if you have a family to feed and your per capita income is about $180 a year, if you can, say, produce something that will bring you $1,000, $2,000, or $5,000, you can see what people will do. And even though the government has outlawed poppy production, there's no enforcement, there's no control.
Where there was under the Taliban.
Under the Taliban, it was brought to zero. This development of the country now producing about 4,500 tons of heroin. And now a lot of it is processed in the country, and then of course it goes through Central Asia and Russia, or through Turkey and the rest of the world. The point though is that this has become now, this last year, drug production was half of the gross domestic product, half of the national economy, so you can imagine, and it's getting worse. And that's why Mr. Costa was saying, unless the international community and the Afghan government do something urgent, the country will be taken over by the narco traffickers. It will make Colombia like, you know, some philanthropic organization. So drugs are a serious problem. Of course, when you have that amount of drug activity, it corrupts people, it corrupts politicians, you have addiction problem, it can undermine elections, it can undermine democracy. You have the whole country riddled with criminals and narco traffickers. It's a very serious problem. But it's now a part of the economy.
And the other part of the economy, I would think, would be the oil production. We haven't talked about that yet, but we all heard the stories that there would be a pipeline built, I believe, through Afghanistan.
Yes. There were serious negotiations, as you know, going on between, in fact, that was one reason why the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan put the Taliban together and introduced them to Afghanistan, because the Mujahideen, the people who preceded the Taliban, people who fought against the Russians and then the communist government, they were too busy fighting amongst themselves. There was no stability, there was no law and order. In the meantime, the United States and the West and the world were very eager to access the oil and gas of Central Asia. And the best and most expedient way would be to build a pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to the port of Gwadar in Pakistan. And the Taliban, when they first came to power, the State Department was very optimistic. In fact, a whole delegation of Taliban were invited to visit the United States, including the State Department, the UNOCAL, because Mr. Karzai and our ambassador designate, Dr. Khalilzad, both were consultants for UNOCAL. Just as Condoleezza Rice has been, for example, a major player in the Chevron, I think it is. So now the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has just completed a feasibility study about this pipeline. And a British oil company called Premium Oil Company from Britain already actually is prospecting in the Jawzjan, the central part of Afghanistan, for oil. So Afghanistan itself has oil and gas, but more importantly, because it's so strategically located, that it would be ideal for the pipeline to connect Central Asia, the Caspian Sea area, because people estimate that oil and gas in the Caspian area is worth about $4 trillion. And the best way to access that is through Afghanistan. And many people have said that this is the U.S. main agenda and main interest. And that's why they're going to stay in Afghanistan for some time and not so much fighting terrorists and terrorism.
And who's going to profit from this oil, this
Well,
pipeline?
it will be like a lot of other countries, for example, Bolivia, for example. You know, Bolivia, as you know, the president wanted to export gas and people rioted and he was kicked out, and he now lives in this country because the people in Bolivia themselves, they don't have enough gas to cook and heat their own homes, but he was going to export gas to the United States and Mexico. So my fear is that unless you have a national, democratic, accountable government, no matter how many resources do you have in Afghanistan or any place else, it's not going to reach the people. It will be, of course, it will benefit the elite and the comprador class and people who are in this business.
Right. So it seems kind of a pattern we have here, where we go into countries and basically extract their resources for profit for basically a few corporate
Unfortunately, you know,
corporations.
that seems to be because I don't know, I'm not convinced at all, for example, that fighting terrorism or the terrorists is the real objective, or that 9/11 was directly connected to the invasion, although I think it provided the justification. But as I said earlier, when the United States and the oil companies found the Taliban too inflexible and rigid and nationalistic, they changed their mind and wanted to replace them. And so, but the economy, the people continue to suffer. I mean, if you go to Afghanistan now and travel, the vast majority of the people live in the Middle Ages. People are desperately poor and sick, and has, you know, it's the lowest on the good indexes and it's the highest on the negative indices throughout the world. And it's difficult to see how this can be solved.
Right. Well, I guess we should talk about the human rights. Yeah, well, yes, a lot of people have been discussing first of all, the Taliban were given a very bad negative report because of the way they treated women. So, and now I think Amnesty International just came out with a report. We're just going to touch on this for a minute before we go on to a break.
Well, you know, the Taliban were very repressive, especially when it comes to women and people who were modern, cosmopolitan, sophisticated. But now with the current situation, and I've heard many, many women actually, they would say, we were not free, but we were safe under the Taliban. Now they would say, we're free, but we feel very unsafe. And that's why the vast majority of the women still cover themselves when they're out on the streets, because they don't feel safe at all.
It's not easy to be free if you're not safe, I guess. Okay, well, we're going to continue with that on a little later, but we're going to take a break right now. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.
The name of this high school is Mushki Alam. It's from 1st grade to 12th, though currently active grades are only up to 9th grade. There are an estimated of 500 to 650 students, all of whom share one water pump. There are 20 teachers who teach several subjects. Classroom size is anywhere between 30 to 40 students. There are no labs in the school or textbooks for the science subjects. And there is no gym or sports equipment either.
Welcome back. Okay, let's get into this report from Amnesty International a little more. And you were saying that some of the women over in Afghanistan have actually been committing suicide and getting into drug addiction. So, and that is much worse than it was before.
It's very hard to be a woman in Afghanistan at any time, any place, anywhere. And the situation has been made worse for them, unfortunately, over the last 2.5 years because of the war and the crises, the factionalism and the gangsterization of society. And so during the Taliban, of course, earlier women went to school in the cities, to universities, they worked in government offices and so forth. When the Taliban came to power, they sent the women back home, except for little girls who could go to school separately. And then now, in the last 2 years, of course, women have been, quote, liberated. And so if you go to Afghanistan now, in the cities, for example, girls do go to school, and you will see women going to work, working in the ministries, teaching schools, some of them working with international organizations and so forth. But even in the cities now, I would say 85 to 90% of the women, even who work, for example, or go to school, wear the chadari and cover. In fact, this was pointed out by the Human Rights Watch report, which was issued in August, but also this most recent report by Amnesty International, talking about the degradation, the suppression, the abuse and misuse of women. Women are endangered in Afghanistan right now. They get kidnapped, they get abducted, they get sold. Early marriage, for example, arranged marriage, simply selling your daughter or your sister because you want to find a means of support for the family. These are common things, and the vast majority of the women still are illiterate, of course, and can't go to school. There's no work for them in government offices or other places. So the conditions of women are truly deplorable. And that's why, for example, even in Herat, in the northern, one of the eastern, southern provinces, if a man and a woman who are not related are seen together, they will be sent for virginity test. So women have been warned, for example, by some of the resistance people not to work with foreigners. Women have a very difficult life right now, and you hear a lot about, for example, women committing suicide, prostitution, but also women actually setting themselves on fire, drug addiction amongst women. These are indications of the difficult conditions of women in Afghanistan.
Right.
And
I
the
just wanted to
Amnesty
mention,
report simply documents all of this, you know, saying women are terribly repressed, they're abused and misused, they're degraded, their economic conditions are hard. There are countless widows left with large families because their husbands were killed or have disappeared. It's a horrible tragedy, one of the more silent tragedies of the situation.
And I just want to mention one thing I read in a Eugene paper was about, I think, around 20 women and children jumped into a river and killed themselves because they were so much worse. They feared more being raped by the Northern Alliance. So I think this is something we have to realize is going on, a specific example, because they really are threatened that they would rather die than have to deal with that kind of degradation and humiliation and suffering.
I remember reading about that, but also if you're there, and I, of course, was in Afghanistan for about a year in the last, year and a half. This is common, very common. Attacks on women, abuse of women, for example, selling them to slavery, abductions, rape, violence, domestic violence. And it looks like there's no recourse for women, especially most women are very isolated. Women really cannot leave their home without a close male with them. And so there's no way for them to either organize themselves or defend themselves. And the government still is a very male-dominated government. It doesn't look like it has a lot of sympathies for the conditions of women. And that's why, for example, women will tell you now that during the Taliban, they were not free, but they felt very safe. Now they're free, but they don't feel safe. And that's why I said most women still cover just to protect themselves from assault and attacks and rape and abduction.
Okay, well, we're going to have to move on from that subject right now and talk about American intervention in the surrounding countries to Afghanistan and how that's affecting the area.
Well, one of the rationalizations was for the invasion of Afghanistan that if you stabilize Afghanistan, you would stabilize South and Central Asia. But it looks like it hasn't gone that way because the United States now has 2 military bases in Afghanistan, in Kabul and Kandahar. It has a military base in Kyrgyzstan near Bishkek. It has a base in Uzbekistan, for example, and it has bases all over the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. Now it occupies Iraq, of course. So imagine if you were a country in that part of the world, you would feel threatened. What has been happening in the last year or so is two of America's allies, Afghanistan and Pakistan, have been having dispute over the boundary, which was decided more than 100 years ago by the British, and it simply cut through the same population, the Pashtun population, to have a border between Pakistan, what was then British India, and Afghanistan, and have a buffer between Russia and Britain. But the Pakistanis and the Afghans now have serious dispute over this border, and there actually have been clashes between Afghan and Pakistani forces. So currently there's a tripartite commission of American, Afghan, and Pakistani governments trying to resolve this dispute. So this is one thing. The other problem is that India and Pakistan now seems to be sort of conducting a proxy struggle against each other in Afghanistan. Iran, for example, feels very, very threatened, I think, by the United States being both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Iran, we know, intervenes in Afghan affairs. Russia, of course, we know, for example, even though President Putin and President Bush get along very well, it seems, but we know that Russia is very much involved in Afghanistan in terms of supporting the Northern Alliance, because Russia would now like, I think, to get even with the United States, the way the United States gave the Russians a hard time throughout the 80s.
Right, exactly.
So Russia is involved, Iran is involved, the other stans are involved because of the ethnic commonalities between Uzbeks in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, Tajiks in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and so forth. So there's a lot of instability, and relationship between the area countries is not very good when it should be.
Okay, so let's end on maybe a more positive note. Let's try and find some kind of solution to this. What would you suggest that people can do, or how they can get involved? And
a couple of things have been done, of course, in Afghanistan. You know, the situation is not completely hopeless. It's desperate and pretty bad, but it's not hopeless. There's now a common currency, for example. People are working on the Constitution. They're trying to have census. Schools have been opened. You know, at least half of the school-age people go to school. There isn't a lot of open warfare everywhere. There are skirmishes. So a few things, of course, have been accomplished, and there's some foreign interest and foreign presence and foreign assistance. But this is a country, again, you know, that has been devastated by its own underdevelopment, its geography, and the last 25 years of sectarian warfare and then invasions. So what we need to do now is to actually have a real major Marshall Plan, the way President Bush said initially that he was going to have a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, to a major economic investment for the next 10 years, an international security assistance force throughout the country, work on education, healthcare, housing, transportation, and communication, improving the human rights situation, really waging war on the narcotics and crime and criminality, and stabilizing the government and developing an effective and clean state apparatus. These are the kind of things that must be done, but they must be done through the UN and through the international organizations. The United States needs to demilitarize its operation and policy in Afghanistan. The State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the United States Agency for International Development, they need to cooperate in Afghanistan, but also the United States needs to withdraw from Afghanistan in the next 12 months, leave the work of the development, peacekeeping, law and order, anti-narcotic activities, human rights situations, ethnic reconciliations to the United Nations and other international organizations. And Americans should put pressure on Washington to follow a different agenda and not simply be chasing, quote, terrorists, because there's no way to fight terrorism this way, in my view.
thank you very much for this information and keeping us posted on what's really going on in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you.
Thanks to Professor Zahar Wahab, thanks to my crew and my guests and everyone for joining us today on Matt is Hell TV. Stay tuned. We're going to give you an update on a previous story we reported about the Level 4 Bioterror Lab at OHSU. And then stay tuned for the No Spin News by Clyde Lewis. Thanks and good night. On a previous program, we reported that Oregon Health Science University could win the bid for a federal grant to fund a Level 4 bioterror lab. Happily, OHSU failed to win the grant for this Level 4 lab. However, tax dollars have been dispersed to 9 cities around the country to build these labs that will house some of the deadliest bioweapons in the world. According to a former lab scientist, if one of these airborne viruses intentionally or accidentally is released from any lab anywhere, it would take about 6 weeks for that deadly virus to travel the globe. Death from this kind of bioweapon would not be quick or painless. Before death, every organ would fail and you would bleed from every orifice, including your eyes. These labs are supposedly a response to the heightened fear of terrorist attacks after the 9/11 tragedy. However, the only leak that we know about took place in a U.S. lab. The anthrax culprit has not been publicly identified or prosecuted, though it is obvious now that the anthrax was delivered to Fort Detrick, Maryland, before it was mailed out. So I think we have to question how safe we are just because OHSU did not win this grant. We have to keep in mind that OHSU still has and will continue to apply for funding to build more Level 3 labs, which have been proven to be unsafe and staffed by untrained, poorly paid technicians. On a final note, I would like to challenge anyone from the OHSU Primate Center Level 3 lab to come on this program and explain what benefit it is to humanity to treat animals like Rodney here to years and years of psychological and physical abuse. Psychologists say that one indicator of a psychopath is the early abuse of animals in childhood. By continuing to allow our tax dollars to fund the kind of cruelty evidenced at the OHSU lab by whistleblower Matt Rossell is to sanction a psychopathic society, critically out of touch with its humanity, lacking basic empathy and compassion for animals who cannot defend themselves. So while we are grateful that OHSU has not won a grant to build this dangerous Level 4 lab, let's not lose sight of the bigger threat from Level 4 labs around the country and the ongoing mistreatment of animals in Level 3 and 4 labs. For information on how you can get involved, see the contact information on the screen.
I'm Clyde Lewis with the Mad as Hell spin on the No Spin News. Whenever I hear about the New World Order, I have to honestly search my heart and ask myself if such a thing can be accomplished. I think that if we look at where we are now as opposed to some 20 years before, you'll probably understand that the tools necessary for this type of system are already being practiced. Our leaders have mentioned that we are spiraling towards a global government. There are many people who believe that a one-world government is impossible to accomplish. The previous attempts to establish a one-world government have failed miserably. So how can it possibly happen again, and how can it be successful? Well, I think it's quite simple. It can be done through a conditioning process that has already been developed and has taken over 2 centuries to master. The idea is to turn the thought of a New World Order globalism into a neo-religious movement that uses the basic conditioning process that has had a great deal of success in the United States. Since the nativity of our country, we have been told time ad infinitum of the men that were inspired by God to create a constitution, which of course is second only to the Bible, is a sanctified document. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, of course, are divided up like so many of the Gospels and Revelations found in the Bible. The men who sign these documents are often positioned in paintings similar to the Apostles of Christ in Renaissance paintings and works. There even seems to be this metaphor of Judas. It's Benedict Arnold. You look at our monuments and government buildings, and they are literally temples built for our gods. Their architecture is mixed with occult symbolism and mimics the buildings of antiquity. Many people will say that this really doesn't mean much in the big picture. Well, I contend that it does. It is all in the presentation. When you use symbols and triggers to guarantee a bit of reverence for a government, you begin to turn it into a civic religion, where all things that the government does is blessed and ordained righteous by God. You have a prophet or a centralized figure in your president that presides over a group of disciples. He lives in a white temple like the White House. And for the first time in the history of these United States of America, this president believes that he is a man of God and that we, the people of this great nation, are living in what could be called the end times. And this is why we are seeing more division amongst the people about having religious dogma and fanaticism being shoved in their face. This is why we see judges defy court orders so that the Ten Commandments can be seen in his chambers. There have been many poor souls that have been manipulated by media to see our war as more than just a war, but a fight for good over evil. Well, how does the media manipulate you? Well, I'm going to show you some examples. It begins during the tragedy of 9/11. Now, we all knew that it was an evil act, but the pictures that ran in newspapers and on television had to knock us over the head with the notion that it was. They were showing us images of the devil seen in the clouds of the burning towers. Now, afterwards, the media took a picture of two beams crossed at ground zero. Now, this reminded us that there was hope. It was obvious that they were using the cross or cruciform symbol as a tool of manipulation. There have been similar pictures released, such as this picture that ran in the papers showing Johnny Walker Lind, the American Taliban, looking eerily similar to the Shroud of Turin, which is allegedly the burial cloth of Christ. Now, here's another picture showing the attack on the Church of the Nativity. Now, you notice the flare in the sky? Strikes a very frighteningly similar image seen on most Christmas cards. Now, later the pictures got more bold. Here's a picture of George Bush with Bill Clinton. Now, notice that below Bush's right hand is a cross. Now, in this picture, you see George Bush with the seal of the United States blurred behind him, so it looks like he has a halo around his head, kind of reminiscent of this painting that I have seen of Jesus Christ. Now, the pictures aren't so subtle. Here's another one, another picture. Now, there's a controversy swirling around this picture that will be shown in GQ magazine showing Bush looking like Jesus Christ himself. Now, the question I have for you is, are we being manipulated into seeing our leaders as gods or prophets? Is this some sort of conspiracy to create a civic religion? For God's sake, I hope not. I'm Clyde Lewis.
Professor Wahab, nice to
hello,
see you
Courtney.
again.
How are you?
Good.
Good to see you again. Come on in,
All
please.
right, you have a seat. We're going to look at some pictures here.
Okay.
And
This is actually our living room in Konsaf, the village, where I was born and raised. So it's a new house, and people sit on the floor, you know, in Afghanistan.
noticed
Most
that.
people have no
so there's no furniture.
No furniture. This is it.
Where's the TV?
People sit. Well, there's no television
No
because there's no electricity.
No electricity?
And no running water. Most things are done by hand in Afghanistan, including fetching water, you know, cooking, cleaning, etc. That's me here, and this is my father's grave, right here.
So this is a cemetery.
This is a cemetery, and this is out in the countryside. It's in Ghazni, sort of about 130 miles southwest of Kabul.
This is your mother here?
Yes, that's
Right.
my mother and me. She doesn't wear the chadari, you know, the burqa. That's not. Most country women don't actually. The burqa is kind of a city costume for city women.
Why is that?
Yeah. Well, it's again covering for women. It's a sign of modesty, but also it's a way of protection against
right,
strangers,
right.
especially right now.
I see.
Where
It's protection.
kidnapping women and children is a very serious problem throughout the country.
And where is it they want to put this pipeline?
Well, the pipeline will be coming from here is Turkmenistan. It will be coming from here, and it will go, I think, like that to Pakistan, and then to the Indian Ocean.
So they would have to get permission from Turkmenistan
The
as well.
Turkmens are very happy here, and they have been talking about this for the last 12 years, but because right now, Turkmen oil and gas and Kazakh oil and gas goes through Russia and then Europe and other parts of the world. And they estimate that there is about $4 trillion worth of oil and gas in Central Asia.